So next lesson for the attachment topic, we're going to look at the Romanian Orphanage study and in particular at institutionalisation. So we visited a number of problems with attachments before. Just to recap, deprivation means when an existing attachment is disrupted. For example, we've looked at the Robertson and Robertson study. Today we're going to focus on a form of privation. So this is when an attachment is never formed. We've looked briefly at the examples of Jeannie and the Czech twins before. But today we're going to go a little bit further into this in terms of institutionalisation. So Jeannie and the Czech twins suffered from privation when they were on their own. They were in the family home and they were not living with others in an institute. Privation can also happen when when children live within an institute or an institution, and this is known as institutionalisation. So it's a form of privation in which a child cannot form an attachment with a caregiver because they've been brought up within a large group where adult carers are inaccessible, and that's either emotionally or physically. So either the carers are not regularly there to form an attachment, or emotionally they're very withdrawn and they make attempts to purposefully not form that attachment. So different examples of institutions. This might be when a child or children are awaiting adoption, for example within an orphanage. It could also be a hospital if they're staying there for long periods of time. Essentially, it's a place where children live for a period of time as opposed to daycare or outpatient care. During daycare, they would go home in the evening, and the same with outpatient care. If they were staying in a hospital, they would also go home in the evening. With an institution, they do not go home, they stay within the institute. So this brings us on to the Romanian orphanages. This refers to not just one orphanage, but there was lots and lots of orphanages all over Romania during the 1990s. In fact, there were about 100,000 orphans in 600 state-run orphanages across the country. The reason for this was Romania at the time was run by a dictator. He encouraged large families, and he also banned abortion. So as you can imagine, family size expanded drastically and parents just couldn't afford to take care of their children, so they placed them in these orphanages to hopefully take good care of them. I've taken some pictures just from a Google search. They were very famous at the time during the 1990s, and you can see the level of care that the children had. It was a very negative place to grow up. The buildings were not really fit for purpose, so there was things like leaking roofs. As you can see, the beds and the kind of furniture that's in the orphanages is again not really fit for purpose, overcrowding, very cramped, and then unfortunately on top of this there was quite a bit of abuse, both physical and sexual abuse that was going on. So really quite a grim place to grow up, not really ideal at all. So this is where RUTTER'S study comes in. So the aim was to assess whether loving and nurturing care can overturn the effects of privation that these children were suffering from. So in terms of methodology, there were 111 orphans that were studied by Rutter. It was a longitudinal study, meaning it went over a long period of time, and it was also a quasi-experiment. The independent variable was the age of adoption, so either adopted before 6 months, adopted between 6 months and 2 years, or adopted over the age of 2 years. The dependent variable was the level of cognitive functioning, and the infants were assessed for height, for head circumference, and also cognitive functioning. Height and head circumference to look whether they were malnourished, to look at the physical effects of the orphanage, and then also the cognitive functioning to look at the cognitive effects. And these children were compared to a control group of 52 British adoptees for the simple reason to see, is it the fact that they've lived in an orphanage and they've been separated from their caregivers, or is it something a little bit deeper? So results, 50% of Romanian orphans had extremely poor cognitive functioning when they were first tested. Most were underweight. And the British children did not show these deficits. So the British children weren't generally underweight, and the level of cognitive functioning was to be expected. In terms of the Romanian orphans, we saw huge improvements when they were revisited at age 4, especially those ones who were adopted under 6 months old, and they were now comparable to the British controls. So they'd made the best improvements in terms of the 3 groups that were looked at from the Romanian orphanages. And subsequent follow-ups after this time, so after they were 4 years old, show that many of the orphans adopted after 6 months still showed disinhibited attachment, and they still have problems with peer relationships. So the older that they were adopted, the kind of more negative the effects were, unfortunately. Disinhibited attachment means that they will try to attach to figures that it's either not really appropriate to, or that they just shouldn't be attaching to. So strangers, people they've met, very, very kind of few and far between. So before next lesson, you need to make sure that you can outline the following without the use of the pre-reading or the notes. So explain what's meant by institutionalisation as a key term. Give the method of RUTTE'S study, including what was tested for each of the 4 groups in detail, and also giving the results again for each of the groups that were studied.